Hi, I'm Reed Peterson and welcome to Grief Refuge. If this is your first time listening, you are in for a treat. Here at Grief Refuge, we hold sacred space for your grief. This is where it gets honored. And you're also invited to explore the deeper understandings of your process and your grief journey. You'll find Grief Refuge to be different from other grief-related podcasts. Instead of scratching the surface, we go much deeper, a lot deeper. Grief can be very emotional and overwhelming. My intention here is to be a soothing voice as you navigate this terrain of emptiness, loneliness, and uncertainty. I do appreciate your listenership, regardless whether this is your first or your 19th time listening. I sincerely hope that you feel more comforted, supported, and cared for as you take another step on this journey. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while you're listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for your self-care and personal reflection. You can use this time to soften and relax into your grief-related feelings so that they can run their course. And most importantly, use this time to mourn your loss. In addition to what you're about to hear next, I also invite you to download the Grief Refuge app, which is available on the App Store or the Google Play Store. On the app, there are more stories, reflections, perspectives, and insights for healing and processing and managing grief. Grief Refuge is free to download, and it is easy to find. Just search Grief Refuge wherever you get your apps on your phone. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. No, I'm not sure if there's stats that have been tallied for the number of people who start something grief support related as a response to their personal loss in their life. But I don't know, I'd bet $1 that it's probably 100%. For me, Grief Refuge started after I reflected on the losses of both my father and my stepfather. And I also see and hear about so many nonprofits, grief centers and camps and charities that are started by people who have experienced tragic loss in their life. Today's guest, Sara Cobb, she's no exception. But I tell you what has stuck with me since the time of our conversation is that Sara's organization, which is called My Grief Connection, it isn't concerned about you becoming a part of their community. In fact, it's the opposite. I've come to learn that Sara started My Grief Connection because she knew that resources for grief support were hard to find, and she wants you to help find those resources within your own community. Sara shares more about her personal losses and the mission and purpose of My Grief Connection in our time together. It's also worth noting that at the time of our interview, Sara was pretty vulnerable and she was feeling some waves of grief. For you see, we talked on the 2-year birthday of our organization, My Grief Connection, and it was also the 3-year anniversary of our brother's death. Many thanks to Sara for her authentic and vulnerable sharing today. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Sara Cobb, welcome to Grief Refuge. I'm really happy you're here today.
Thank you so much, Reed. I'm really excited to be with you and get to have another conversation with you. I always enjoy getting to talk with you.
I look forward to our conversations. I feel like there's a special connection we have. I haven't been able to name it yet, but hopefully through what we discussed today, maybe there will be like a title for some of our special connection. But I wanted to first say that I'm aware of the timing of our recording. It's a very special time, and it sounds like you celebrated a 2-year birthday of one of the things you gave birth to, which is My Grief Connection.
Yes, yesterday was July 4th, 2021, and it was the second birthday of mygriefconnection.org. And actually launched My Grief Connection in 2019 on July 4th. I spent a whole day in a cafe trying to figure out how to make a website. And my goal was just actually to have a basic web page with some links on it to grief resources and some local grief support groups, and maybe some counselors, some crisis help information, just a few things that I had found helpful in my grief process in the year before. And I had been pretty frustrated that it was really hard to find grief resources. I couldn't find them all in one place, at least. I couldn't find like a central hub where I could go to find the things that I needed to support me in my grief. And I had kind of voiced this to my counselor a few weeks before, and she came back at me with, well, maybe that's something that you could find a solution for or be a part of finding a solution for. At first, I was a little annoyed by that suggestion because I felt like, oh, I'm the one that needs, the help. I need the resources. I shouldn't have to, be the one to put it together kind of thing. But the more I thought of it over the next couple of weeks, the more I realized I actually probably be pretty good at that, because I have a background of reference work in a library, and I do a lot of genealogy research and things like that. So I'm pretty good at gathering resources, and I really like connecting people as well, connecting people with resources and with each other. And so kind of thinking about those things, I thought maybe I could do a website, even though I'm not a web designer at all. I'd have to learn the technology part, but I think I have, the skills to bring the resources together in one place, and maybe that would help other grievers. So that was kind of the general sort of inspiration behind actually sitting down and making the web page. But really, my real inspiration was born out of my own grief from the loss of my older brother, Skylar. He had died the year before, on July 4th of 2018, in a murder-suicide. And unfortunately, he was the perpetrator of that act, and he took the life of his fiance and then immediately took his own life. That, turned my life upside down. Getting the news the next day at work, my dad called me to let me know that they had their bodies had been found, and there was a gun involved, and we didn't have all the details then, but that was enough to pretty much blow up my life and turn things upside down. We were all just really stunned that this could happen in our family, and nobody expects that kind of tragedy, but we really didn't. Just knowing the kind of person that Sky was, it was a real shock to us all. And so yeah, I spent the first year after his death trying to pull together the pieces of my life, and figure out, what do I do now? It really, the loss of someone that you are really close to. This was the first really major loss that I experienced. I had some other losses, but this was the closest relationship I had, lost in this way. It just really kind of flipped me upside down and turned. I guess I felt like I lost my identity a bit, and I wasn't sure who I was, or things felt so wrong in the world, and there was a lot of questioning of myself and also of him, and wondering about how much did I really know him as well as I thought I did, and just there's lots of things, lots of stuff that comes up, and I was just in kind of a tizzy, I guess, and not really sure what to do with myself and how I could go on and live a life, that had meaning and purpose. I wanted that, but I just didn't know how to get there. Mm-hmm. So it took a lot of hours in counseling, and a lot of journaling and writing letters, and praying and meditating, and just sitting in the grief and learning to learning how to grieve, I guess, how
Mhm.
I needed to grieve. Yeah, so I mean, I basically spent almost a year, really working through all of that, and it just all ended up coalescing right around the first anniversary, where I decided that I wanted to do something with all that I'd learned, and to help other people that were grieving, to give some people to give people a little bit of hope that there are resources and support materials, and there's community out there, and that they're not alone. And so, yeah, it just kind of all coalesced in this weird way, like right before the first anniversary. And so, yeah, that's kind of how my grief connection started.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really just deeply appreciative of the openness of what you're sharing and giving us some of the history to how this all came about. We will definitely talk a little bit more about the grief that you experienced. I do, I just am sitting with this question about with the counseling that you've done and then the counselor you worked with making the suggestion about you creating the resource that you initially were looking for. When you look back at the sessions that you had and the relationship that you had with that counselor, are you able to connect the dots to recognize like there were many suggestions throughout the process and the relationship that you had with the counselor, or was it kind of like a one-time thing where the counselor just kind of like matter of factly stated maybe you should create that?
It really was that one time kind of thing. Honestly, I don't think we had talked about anything like that before. Um, it just sort of happened in this one session, where where I was saying, like, it's so hard to find all this stuff, and why isn't there one place I can go to, and I don't know. It was just like a magic moment, where where she said that, and I was like taken back by it at first, honestly, and just like, what, like, I don't, and just questioning, like, how would I even do that? I don't have any training with web design or anything like that, and I was really shocked, honestly, that she should suggested it. So I did have to sit with it for a couple of weeks, but once it clicked in my head, and I was like, she's right. Dang it. I'm going to have to create this because nobody out there is like, you know, racing, to do it. It won't happen if somebody doesn't take the initiative and do something about it. And I kind of felt like, well, what other choice do I have? Like I couldn't get rid of the thought that I needed to do this, or that somebody did. And I guess it was going to have to be me.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It
and
stuck
then
with you.
and yeah, and it was so close to the anniversary. It was literally like I think 3 weeks before the anniversary when I had the first thought, or when she made that suggestion. So I didn't have that much time, and I was trying to think of what to do for the first anniversary, because it's hard. Those man, the anniversaries and the holidays and things like that can be really hard, and it's hard to know what can you do on that day. What do you do just to honor and remember your person? That's something that's significant, that has meaning, or you don't have to. And I've certainly had those kind of holidays and things where I just sort of was like, I'm just going to be in bed all day, and I'm not doing anything really significant. I'm just going to be sitting in it, and that's okay too. But for me, for some reason, on that 1 year anniversary, I really felt the need to do something big, I guess, in
Mm-hmm.
my mind. Something um, that would help me get through the day as much as it would honor and remember them.
Well, you definitely succeeded in creating something big because when I first came across my grief connection, I was like, wow, I've looked at hundreds of hospice websites that have some kind of tab on their website that says resources. And when you click on it, you look and see perhaps there's a dozen articles, maybe a couple other links to complementary organizations to whatever they provide. But when I came across my grief connection, I was like, Okay, I've found the mecca of grief-related resources here.
Wow. Oh, thank you. That's such a nice compliment.
Yeah, so thank
Oh,
you because
yeah.
everybody listening to this has got to check this out because
Mm,
there's a lot available there and there's good stuff too. And what I love specifically about what you've created is because I know pieces of your story and I
mm,
know how important honoring the grief process and honoring the loved one
right.
is in the creation of this.
Yeah.
And that's the foundation of my grief connection. Those are the undertones
Yeah.
with the purest of intentions. And so it's not just some kind of like business whatever. It's more of a mission driven project. I don't even want to call it a project. A mission driven organization,
Yeah.
a purpose driven organization. I also love that it blends and utilizes all these skills that you have, with past work experiences and also just pieces of your personality. And so I'm just really, really grateful that you created this, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that that makes me so happy when I hear those kind of comments because it truly is the point of it all is, you know, to to be that place that people can go to find those connections. And
You mentioned the original goal to have some resources locally.
yeah.
Now that it's 2 years of a birthday for My Grief Connection, has the goal evolved?
Yeah, I think it's constantly kind of evolving, I guess. But definitely that's kind of the core of it, I suppose, is, to have those kind of resources. I originally, of course, when was thinking just locally, I was thinking just, my area, like there's nothing I couldn't find where were the grief groups and the counselors and stuff for my local area. And that's where I was kind of like wanting to kind of fill that gap. And it's just, it has grown since then. It's expanded my mission, like you said. So now I certainly still have a lot of resources for the local area, and I try to make sure to keep those up to date and to keep adding to those. But it's definitely gone far beyond that now, and I don't know where it's going to end. It's honestly just like anything I can find that I think would be beneficial for other grievers. I try to add. So it's hard sometimes because eventually I'm going to run out of room, I guess, or I just keep having more and more tabs and stuff. But maybe I do need to look at it eventually and kind of pare things down a little. But there's so many different types of grief and there's so many different, support and resources out there. And some things are out of the box too. They may not be like initially like might not think like, oh, that's a grief resource. But I want to have like a wide array of options on there for people because we all do experience grief so differently, and we have just different needs and interests and different times in our grieving process. Certain types of resources might appeal to us, and sometimes that might change in the future. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just I want to keep it growing. The thing is that this has been my sort of part-time, well, actually more of a full-time side unpaid, passion project of mine. And it's a one person show, so I'm doing it all. And so sometimes it's a little overwhelming because there is a lot I would like to do with it, a lot more I would like to do with it. I would like to have it be even more organized than it is, and more kind of broken down by different categories so people can search for their particular kind of loss or the particular type of resource they want. Broadly sort of broken down that way, but it's not as much as I would like. And it's just I have limited time and resources, and technical ability to do that. So I hope with time I can make some adjustments to it so that it is even more user friendly and more searchable and has more resources that cover things maybe haven't even thought about yet. There could be types of loss I haven't even really considered or found a resource for. So I'm always open to adding more and updating it and making it better. Grief groups or things like that. I'm not really sure when that will happen, but hopefully someday. There's a lot of possibilities.
There definitely
Yeah,
is. And as long as you stay open
yeah.
to what sounds like a lot of divine momentum in your
Hmm.
experience too, that vision will formulate as far as how the growth will happen. Makes me think of a time I was in Italy. It was 2009, and first time I was in Florence, and we were with a family friend, and we were standing outside. I can't remember which one it was, but we were standing outside this Duomo, and we were both looking up at it. And he said, "Do you realize this thing took over 100 years to build?" And I was like, "No,
Wow.
I didn't realize that." And he looked at me and he spread his arms wide and said, "Somebody had a vision." And
Yeah.
I was like, "That's amazing." And I kind of that memory came to
Yeah.
mind, Sarah, as you were sharing more about my grief
Hmm.
connection, because I think you're just getting started. And I look forward to more of what happens with my grief connection. And I also want to ask you a question, because you were talking about types of services, and you shared a little bit more about how you worked with a counselor in working through some of your grief. Tying into my grief connection, what are some of the resources that you have on the website that are surprising to you?
Yeah, I would say, there's a few that were, I mean, there were definitely a lot that I found that I had no idea existed before. And in that way, they were kind of a surprise, like, oh, there is an organization for this or that or whatever. But as far as like, I guess some of the more unique ones would be there are a couple organizations under, I have a section about grief in the body. And so there's a couple of people out there that are doing movement specifically for grievers. Um, so they're kind of exercise based sort of programs, but they're specifically meant to help you move emotions in your grieving process and help and at a pace that's would be maybe easier for someone who's grieving. um, so I thought those were really cool. And there's a lot of stuff on there about I have some things about how to handle the deceased effects. And I thought that was a helpful thing. Like, you may not think of that as a grief resource, but it is. It's a hard thing to go through your loved one's items and have to make decisions about what to keep and what to give away or what to sell, and dealing with family members on how to split things up and all of that. So um, having having some resources for that, I think, can be really helpful in the grieving process. It may just seem like it's like a business thing, like the business side of death, but it does really play into grief, because there's so much emotion attached to belongings.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I thought that was a helpful resource to have on there. With COVID, I actually decided to start a whole page of COVID related grief resources. So there is a whole page dedicated to things specific um, to grief that's related to the losses that we've all been experiencing with the pandemic. Um, and there were actually some specific grief resources that were created during COVID. Like, there's a grief resource like hotline, and there's a couple of things like that were created where people who are experiencing grief or just um, I guess mental health issues or distress because of the pandemic, that they can contact or reach out to and get help for those issues. So I mean, we tend to think of grief being connected specifically to death, but it's not just death that makes us grieve. And I think I guess in a way that was a little, not really a surprise to me, but it hit me more as I was doing more research into this, that like, oh yeah, grief is complicated, and wide and deep and like there's a lot to it. And I hadn't really thought too much about grief before, I guess, until I lost Sky. And it really plunged me into the world of grief and the way that I'm built. I'm like, I research everything to death. Literally, because I get a little obsessive about needing information, and that's a source of comfort for me, like finding information.
Hmm.
And so I just kind of felt this need to do all this research, and it just unearthed all this stuff about grief that I had no idea about before, or maybe had a vague idea but didn't really think about too much because it really hadn't come into my sphere. And now I see grief in like a very different way than I used to. And so I guess I kind of think of sometimes things as like, oh, that would be a great grief resource, even though it's maybe not directly related to death. Um, because, we grieve over a lot of things. We grieve over things that we lose. And that can be even ideas, or concepts, or things we think are going to happen in the future that never end up happening, or things we wish would have been different in the past. So yeah, it's just there's a lot, I think, out there still for me to discover, that I think will help people in their grief process, whether they've lost a person, a pet, a thing, a concept, an idea, an event that was supposed to happen that never did. Maybe that's the biggest kind of surprise to me, is just, that my definition of what encompasses, something that can be grieved, has changed so much.
Hmm. It gets me thinking. I think that's one of the things that I respect your work so much, is because you really honor the diversity of grief or
Mm.
grief experiences in the resources that you provide. That's why I call it my grief connection, the mecca
Mm.
of grief related resources. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
Sarah, as you manage your grief, as you continue to manage it, what else do you find as sources of comfort?
Yeah, I would say, my biggest source of comfort personally is my faith. That's been huge for me. Yeah, I mean, I try to spend time every day reading, materials that are like devotional type materials, and meditating and praying, and spending time, and that's in my spiritual sort of bubble, I guess. So that's really important to me. I do a lot of, spend a lot of time praying, and not just like formally sitting and, or kneeling and praying, but like it's just a conversation I have ongoing with God. And that brings me a lot of comfort. I weirdly have found so much peace after Sky died, peace that I didn't have before. Like in a lot of areas of my life, not just with his death
Mhm.
or related to his death. But yeah, I mean, his death really actually brought me a lot closer to God.
Mhm.
And you know, he had been through a lot in his life, a lot of trauma, and um, just a lot of struggles and stuff. I really felt peace knowing that he was out of pain.
Mhm.
So that's brought me a lot of comfort. I think of that a lot when I'm struggling. And that he's fine, he's good, and that helps. But of course, yeah, I mean, I did a lot of counseling, and that's been super helpful. And my counselor also has similar faith to me, so we can talk about those issues, which has been really good. And I mean, other things that I've done, I do a lot of journaling, and I've done some letter writing. That's very powerful. I've written letters to him, and then written letters from him to me. Yeah, I mean, I try to spend more time out in nature, on walks, and uh, sometimes I actually like take out the earbuds, so that's helpful for me, when I can just be kind of quiet and just be open to listen to
Mhm.
what's happening, in nature, and get out of my head a little bit, I guess, in a way.
Sarah, it sure sounds like you do a lot to honor your grief.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that always be like that? Or have you noticed like an opening or a softening or a different word that you may call it to
Mm-hmm.
honor some of your own grief experience?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot to honor my grief. I try to, because I feel like it's really important to really feel and experience it. I want to be able to live forward in my life and have meaning and feel hope and make a difference, and I don't feel like I can do that if I don't really fully process my emotions and what I'm going through with my grief. It's not easy all the time, but I keep trying. I keep trying. Yeah, I mean, counseling has been super helpful for me in a lot of ways. So I think that was really important. And I did pretty intensive counseling for probably the first 6 to 8 months. I started counseling about 3 months after Sky died, and then I, for about 6 to 8 months, was doing sometimes 2 or 3 sessions a week just
Mm-hmm.
to get a grip on things. And now it's more at a normal, regular, like I still go once a week, usually. But I found, after about 6 or 8 months or so, it was when I started to really feel a big shift and felt like, oh, not all of our sessions are actually about grief anymore. Like I was talking about
Mm-hmm.
other things that were coming up in my life, and sometimes we wouldn't talk about it at all in a session. And to me, that ended up being a big clue that I had really, been doing better about allowing myself to really feel it when it came up and experience it and go through it.
Mm-hmm.
And that just lifted a lot of the heaviness of the grief off of me. I feel like I live, pretty freely now. I mean, I still obviously have times when it's hard or when I'm emotional or sad about it or get triggered, but I feel like it happens less frequently and it's less intense now. And I'm less judgmental of myself when I do it, like I just like, oh, there it is. There's my grief. I'm just going to let that come up, and I just feel it. And then I can go on to the next thing, and it's weird because some days I feel like I, I think it's a part of the way our society sort of deals with grief. I do sometimes have those judgmental thoughts of myself, in my grieving process and wonder if I'm doing it right. Even though I know there is no right or wrong, and I tell people that all the time, but I still sometimes have those thoughts myself, and I have to constantly remind myself that, there's no right or wrong. However I'm doing it is okay. It's what I need to go through. But yeah, I mean, I feel so much less, of the heaviness and the pain and I don't know, I guess the gravity of the grief, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. The weight of it, I don't really feel that very often anymore.
Okay.
And sometimes it's hard to judge myself because I feel like maybe I'm not grieving hard enough. Maybe I'm not. Why am I not hurting more? It should hurt more than this. But I have to remind myself that that's not true. I mean, I'm doing it fine. And that's the point. We go through these weird cycles, I think, in grief too, because sometimes we feel terrible and we want to feel good, and then when we feel good, we feel like we don't feel bad enough. It's a strange thing. And I'm definitely have those thoughts too, just I think like most grievers do, questioning whether or not you're grieving hard enough or if you're grieving too hard.
You're very right.
Yeah.
Almost every conversation I have with someone who's grieving, self-judgments and right or
Yeah.
wrongs
Yeah.
are a part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's very normal in grief in our culture. Hmm. Well, Sarah,
Yeah.
as we think about your experience in creating My Grief Connection and also honoring so much of your own grief, what do you think is the most important piece of not advice, but just words of wisdom that to the listener who's hearing this now could benefit from hearing from you?
I guess I would say that just be kind to yourself and have compassion for your own process. You haven't done this before, even if you've lost someone or had some sort of grief experience in the past, you haven't had this particular grief experience or this particular loss that you're going through. And so it's new. And there's a process, a learning curve, I guess, of what this process is going to be like for you with this grief that you're dealing with now. So I think you have to just give yourself a lot of space and grace for however it looks, and yeah, and just know that grief is really messy, and there's no formula for it. There's no timeline. There's no right or wrong. I mean, there's healthier or non-healthier maybe ways of expressing your grief or dealing with it, but it's up to you to kind of determine, I think, what your grief path will look like. And you don't need to shape your grief to fit what other people think it should fit into. I think just allowing yourself to go through this process in a way that feels right to you is really important.
Sarah, that's so appreciated. Thank you so much. And thanks for being a part of Grief Refuge.
Thank you.
Sarah's a special person who has a big heart and wants to help others. As an afterthought about her efforts to help you find resources for your community, if you have suffered a murder-suicide loss, Sarah actually co-facilitates a support group, and they meet virtually. The group was founded to provide hope and collectively support each other through this rare type of loss, which unfortunately is an everyday occurrence here in the United States. If you have experienced this type of loss, please email Sarah to learn more about the group. Her email address is mygriefconnection@outlook.com. That is going to do it for today's episode. I want to thank you so much for joining me and Sarah today. It's such an honor to hold space for your grief and your healing. If you found this podcast episode to be helpful, please let us know by rating and reviewing the Grief Refuge podcast, or you can send us a message at griefrefuge.com. Before we say goodbye, I do want to remind you about that Grief Refuge app. It's available for you for more support in your grief journey. Grief Refuge is a pretty amazing tool to have when grief is hitting you hard. As one of the community members of Grief Refuge wrote in her review, Grief Refuge is interesting and interactive. It helps me to gauge my emotions daily, which gives me a tangible sense of where I am in my grief on any given day. And that allows me to look back to see where I've come from. So if grief is making you feel lost or isolated right now, download the app for free to start feeling more comfort and support. That will do it for today. I want to thank you again. Take good care. Keep honoring your grief. Do be kind to yourself and talk to you soon.